This time on The Greats, Hanan Ashrawi's contribution to peace, Hollywood's titan Steven Spielberg, the unbelievable life of J.K. Rowling, and Roger Bannister remembers the 4-minute mile. But first, The Suffragettes, Part 2. At the end of the first decade of the 20th century, British women were still disenfranchised. The suffragettes stepped up their militant campaign, drawing attention to their cause through acts of civil disobedience, arson, and bombings. In 1914, most suffragettes threw their weight behind the war effort. Using funding from the government, leader Emmeline Pankhurst organized a parade of 30,000 women to encourage businesses to employ women so men could leave for the front. The war divided the Pankhurst family. Daughter Christabel followed her mother's lead. But her sister Sylvia was a pacifist and formed the Women's Peace Army to campaign for a negotiated settlement to the war. Sylvia also opened 4 mother and baby clinics in London, observing that more babies had died in the first year of the war than British soldiers. Another sister, Adela, fell out with her family and emigrated to Australia, where she joined the peace movement, became an active communist, and then defected to a fascist organization. The war had a huge impact on women's position in British society. The number of women in employment rose from 3 million to almost 5 million by the end of the war. In 1918, Parliament passed a law extending voting rights to women aged over 30. However, it was another 10 years before British women achieved the same voting rights as men. The first woman elected to the British Parliament was Countess Constance Markievicz, a Sinn Féin activist who was serving a prison term for her anti-conscription activities. She refused to take up her seat in the House of Commons, as it would have involved swearing an oath of allegiance to the King. The first woman to actually enter Parliament was Viscount Nancy Astor, who won a 1919 by-election. In 1953, former suffragettes gathered to celebrate their achievements and remember the bitter struggle that saw many of them jailed. They included Mary Richardson, who displayed the medals commemorating her prison hunger strike. Eileen Casey and Lillian Lenton went to jail 6 times. The brave people who defied convention to fight for female emancipation were fated as heroes and heroines. At Westminster, a statue to Emmeline Pankhurst stands as a memorial to the suffragette struggle. The activist herself died in 1928, just a few weeks after women were given equal voting rights to men. A recent exhibition at the Women's Library in London celebrated the 100th anniversary of Emmeline Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union by charting the history of the suffragette movement. Sourced from a wide range of private and public collections, the artifact showed how women of the time used everything from embroidery to the latest printing techniques to spread their demands for equality. One Australian suffragette even distributed pamphlets over London from an airship. Muriel Matters visited Britain in 1908 and gained public notoriety when she was arrested for chaining herself to the grille that enclosed the ladies' gallery in the House of Commons. Muriel was sentenced to a month's jail, but the grille was permanently removed.
If you say to most people in this country now, do you know it's only 75 years since women had the vote on the same terms of men, they'll say, what? And particularly younger women, they're absolutely flabbergasted when they realise it's within their grandparents' or their great-grandparents' memory that women became equal citizens. So it's incredibly important, really, that people have that sense of their history, and also just really energising, I think. Some people really go out on a limb for what they believe in and to get equal rights, and I really respect that.
It took 61 years after the first woman was elected to British Parliament for Britain to elect its first female Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher took office in 1979, and the suffragette effort also paved the way for other women to reach the top of their fields. It's thanks to the vision and determination of these women that their granddaughters and great-granddaughters have so many opportunities. Middle Eastern politics is complicated and often murky. It inspires passionate argument and deeply held enmities and loyalties. It's also largely conducted by men, with the odd exception. The most notable is perhaps Hanan Ashrawi, a Palestinian academic and political activist who's been deeply involved in political causes in her homeland for over 30 years. Born to Christian Palestinian parents in 1946, Ashrawi grew up to become a professor of English literature. From 1973 to 1995, she taught at the Bezit University near Ramallah in the middle of the West Bank. But with a father who was one of the founding members of the Palestine Liberation Organization, politics was part of her genetic makeup. In 1974, in between teaching and publishing writings on Palestinian culture, she founded the university's Legal Aid Committee and Human Rights Action Project. 14 years later, she joined the Intifada Political Committee. In this role, she appeared on American TV's Nightline program in April 1988, which catapulted her to global recognition as a voice of reason in the debate over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
The level of violence is unacceptable, the need for peace is urgent. The British government wants to talk to both sides and see if there is a way to move the whole process forward. Hanan Ashrawi is one of the leading Palestinians. She's been part of peace negotiations in the past, and she's in many ways a voice of sanity in a situation where we have suicide bombing and violence and repression of the Palestinian people. So I wanted to talk through some of the issues with her. There is contact between Israelis and Palestinians. There are people who want to work towards peace. The British government is trying to encourage those efforts. So I hope that contacts like the one I had today will provide encouragement for those who want to work towards a peace settlement.
After Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin's historic signing of the Oslo Accords in the early 90s, in which self-rule for Palestine was established, Ashrawi was made head of the preparatory committee of the Palestine Independent Commission for Citizens' Rights. Other government positions followed, but in 1998 she resigned from her post as education minister, protesting about political corruption and Arafat's handling of the peace talks. 2 years later, Ashrawi founded a new initiative. Dubbed Miftah, it's a Jerusalem-based institution working towards fostering democracy and good governance within Palestinian society. Its aims include reinforcing the Palestinian state-building process and increasing global awareness of regional issues. In November 2003, the New South Wales Premier Bob Carr presented Ashrawi with the Sydney Peace Prize. The award was boycotted by its main sponsor, the City of Sydney, and Jewish groups also criticised her selection. Ashrawi was surprised by the level of animosity she encountered in a country so far from home. Her speech emphasized the importance of cooperation and understanding.
There can be no legitimacy for Israel without the Palestinians, and there can be no legitimate Palestinian state without sharing the land of Palestine and recognizing the legitimacy of the State of Israel. So from here, it's neither the mentality of the revolution or militarism or unilateralism, nor the mentality of the occupation and control and coercion, but the mentality and attitude of humanity, of warmth, of fraternity and sisterhood, and of genuine recognition and validation of our collective narrative and of our distinctive identities. I do love you all wholeheartedly. Thank you.
According to legendary director David Lean, Steven Spielberg makes movies to entertain his teenage self. And it's a formula that's proved gold for the most successful filmmaker of all time. Spielberg made his first films as a child on an 8mm camera and quickly graduated to directing TV series for Universal. He hit pay dirt with Jaws. As well as being a huge commercial success, it won 3 Oscars. Close Encounters of the Third Kind featured Spielberg's fascination with the unknown. It was inspired by a 140-minute film he made as a 16-year-old. The cast included Francois Truffaut, the famous French director and one of Spielberg's idols. However, Spielberg was so intimidated by working with the great man that he could not bring himself to direct Truffaut and let takes go through that would normally have been reshot. Close Encounters was made with state-of-the-art special effects. The primary special effects model of the alien mothership is now on display at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Raiders of the Lost Ark was a rollicking return to the serials of the 1930s and 40s. Born from a concept created by George Lucas, Spielberg considered the movie a James Bond film without the hardware. It premiered in 1981 and became the year's highest-grossing film, earning $384 million from a $20 million budget. 3 sequels and a television series followed, each equally successful. In the year following Raiders, Spielberg directed E.T., the Extraterrestrial, considered by many to be the greatest sci-fi film of all time. The endearing alien was based on an imaginary friend Spielberg invented in childhood to help him cope with his parents' divorce. While not every film he worked on was a success, Spielberg's eye for a good story saw him involved in both the Back to the Future and Jurassic Park franchises, 2 of Hollywood's biggest box office draws. But he also demonstrated a serious side, winning acclaim for dramas The Color Purple and Empire of the Sun. These films laid the ground for Schindler's List. Spielberg, who is Jewish, had been waiting a decade to film Thomas Keneally's novel about Oskar Schindler, the German industrialist who saved more than 1,000 Jews during the Holocaust. The sobering subject matter seemed out of place in a Spielberg epic, and even Spielberg himself was apprehensive as to whether he could do it justice. But the story he brought to the screen was a restrained, elegate lament for man's inhumanity, touched with hope for the future. He refused to take a director's salary for the film, calling it blood money.
My goodness, Stephen made a very truthful film, because for the reverberations to be this powerful 10, 11 years later and on into the future is something that I'm hugely privileged to be a part of.
I was so, involved in filmmaking all my life that I never really had a cause, so to speak, that I could believe in and support and, devote so much of my life to. And when this came along, that's when I say it changed my life. I found my soul.
Schindler's List won Best Picture and Best Director at the 1993 Academy Awards and led Spielberg to found the Shoah Foundation, an organization dedicated to collecting the stories of Holocaust survivors and fighting intolerance. But Spielberg still enjoys making action blockbusters.
The thing is, whenever I'm asked, is there a message I want to get across when I make a movie, I always hesitate to give the definitive message, because that would stop all of you from having your own opinions. And, every one of you who sees War of the Worlds, it'll be a unique experience. And every one of you might see something differently in it than even I saw making it. So I'd like to leave it to you to decide what you feel, how you feel, and what you think.
In the world of children's books, there are successful authors. And then there is J.K. Rowling. It's estimated that to date she's sold nearly 400 million copies of her books. To put this into perspective, that's around the same number as Enid Blyton. Blyton, however, produced 800 titles over 40 years. Jo Rowling achieved those incredible sales figures with just 7 novels in 10 years. The books are, of course, the Harry Potter series, which started in 1997 and came to a conclusion in 2007. When Rowling began the first book, she was a single mum living in Edinburgh and had to get her baby to sleep before she could get any writing done in the local cafe.
He was in such a bad mood by the time he got to divination that he had quite forgotten his careers appointment with Professor McGonagall, remembering it only when Ron asked him why he wasn't in her office. He hurtled back upstairs and arrived out of breath, only a few minutes late. "Sorry, Professor," he panted.
J.K. Rowling was born in July 1965 in Gloucestershire. Harry Potter, however, was born fully formed one day in 1990 when she was on a 4-hour delayed train trip from Manchester to London. But while she was writing, she lost her mother after a long battle with multiple sclerosis. The emotional effects of this go a long way to explaining the feelings of loss that permeate the whole series. 12 publishers famously rejected Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone before Bloomsbury took it up on the recommendation of the chairman's 8-year-old daughter after she'd read the first chapter. And the books have been a publishing phenomenon. Credited with getting a whole generation of children interested in reading again, they've also been surprisingly successful with adults. By the time The Deathly Hallows was released in 2007, sales records were being blasted out of the water. It became the fastest-selling book of all time and sold 11 million copies in the UK and US on its first day of release. The first 5 film versions met with equally stunning success, grossing more than $4 billion, making Harry Potter the highest-earning film franchise of all time. But with success came high expectations, and Rowling's plot and character choices were subjected to intense scrutiny, something she was happy to see the end of when she completed the series.
To an extent, the pressure's off, I suppose, because it's the last book, so I feel quite liberated. I can just resolve the story now, and it's fun. It's fun in a way that it hasn't been before, because finally I'm doing my resolution. I think some people will loathe it and some will love it, but that's how it should be.
Once the 7th book was out, it was time for Rowling to say goodbye to Harry. To ease the process, she decided to handwrite and illustrate a fairy tale story as a gift to 6 people who were closely connected to Harry Potter. The Tales of Beedle the Bard was referred to in the final Potter book. A 7th handwritten story was auctioned and raised almost £2 million for a children's charity in the Czech Republic.
I probably won't say goodbye in any meaningful sense for a few more years because they're still making the films, of course, and I'm still very involved with the films, which is wonderful. I will forever, I know and you know that I will forever be known as the writer of Harry Potter, and I'm completely fine with that. Harry has given me more than I could have ever dreamed of, and I'm very grateful to him.
And who wouldn't be grateful? Thanks to Harry and his pals, Rowling has earned more than $1 billion. The mother of 3 donates much of her time and money to deserving causes, with various children's charities particularly high on her list of priorities.
I'm really happy. I certainly hasn't. I think I've become happier and happier, and part of that reason is that I feel I'm doing the thing that I most want to do, and I think that I've got better at it, actually, because I think the last book was my favourite of the series, so that was the best way to end.
On the 6th of May 1954, a young medical student called Roger Bannister sprinted his way into the history books by running a mile in under 4 minutes. The momentous event occurred on the Iffley Road track in Oxford, and time hasn't dimmed Bannister's memory of the race.
It's wet, it's cold, but it isn't windy. And of the 3 things that I didn't want to happen on the day, wind was the worst, because it slows you down more than it helps you when it's behind you, and it makes your running irregular. And the whole business of running a 4-minute mile was to spread the energy as evenly as possible. And the first lap I thought, Chris Brasher was going too slowly, because for 5 days I had rested, so naturally I was very full of running. So I shouted faster, and he took no notice, and he said later, A, he couldn't run any faster, and B, he thought he was on time. First lap 58, just right, just under 60, because you sprint for the first 10 yards or so. And then at the half mile, 1:58, perfect. And then naturally in the third lap, when Chris Chataway had taken over, things were slowing down a bit. So the third lap was 62, and that made 3 minutes 05. And then I had to decide whether to overtake him then or just wait for another bend. Another bend meant that I didn't have to run wide, and I didn't want to run an extra 6 yards, because that actually was the amount by which I broke the record. So I kept behind him and then did all I could. And I didn't know whether I was slowing down, but I thought I should be capable of running a last lap in 59 seconds, and there we are.
It was the Everest of athletic achievement and brought Bannister worldwide attention. After coming fourth in the 1952 Olympics, it was his chance to redeem himself in the eyes of the British public.
First is I'm very glad to have done it in Oxford, because this was the track on which I ran my first mile race in my life about 7 years ago when I first came up to Oxford. The second is that throughout the winter I've been watching the newspapers, seeing whether Landy would do it first or whether Santee would do it first in America. And I'm very glad that it has come from England in the end.
46 days later, Australian runner John Landy also beat the 4-minute mile. But when the two came up against each other in the 1954 Empire Games, it was Bannister who took the honours. Landy was leading for most of the race, but at the crucial moment he looked behind to see Bannister's position and was overtaken. Later that year, Bannister retired from racing to concentrate on a career as a neurologist. And he found medical work provided bigger challenges than athletics.
I am primarily a doctor, and that was the greatest challenge. And you never reach the end of learning how to do things better, and how to treat patients better, and how to do research better. So I undertook a deliberate challenge which I would never achieve. I think it's very good to be put in your place in that way.
Bannister believed the 4-minute mile was a psychological rather than a physical achievement. The man who can drive himself further once the effort gets painful is the man who will win, he said. Despite a lifetime of honours, including a knighthood, and a coin minted especially to mark the 50th anniversary of his run, Bannister is philosophical about the race that made him an overnight sensation.
Oh, my medical career, but it's not something which is public, and one doesn't expect any acclaim. But once you've been through a sporting fame phase, then you realise how insubstantial it is. It's very fleeting.